Great. Shashi, thank you so much for joining us at Devex World. So you started at JH Labs almost just 1 year ago. Happy work anniversary, just to start us off. And one of the things that you said you were excited about was taking innovations to the last mile. Why was this so important for you?
Well, innovation for the sake of innovation is just an intellectual exercise, right? And it's very important to start with the end in mind, right? And so what that means is thinking about the users, which are the companies that will take things to market. What do the global supply chains look like so we don't have the kinds of issues we saw with COVID? So that we plan for sustainability right from the start.
Okay, and in many ways, COVID shows us how quickly innovations can be brought to scale, but it also highlighted inequity in terms of access to these innovations. What can we do and what should we be doing to ensure that we can address this inequity?
So if you think about among the problems that happen, starting with the PPE stuff, then the diagnostics, and then the vaccines and so on and so forth, one of the main problems that highlights is the concentration of the global supply chain. And what that can lead to is things like vaccine nationalism and so on and so forth, right? The big lesson from that is trying to figure out how to think of what we call the IP global supply chain, which means that even if something is invented somewhere, there's no reason it cannot be at least last mile manufactured in at least the region, if not the country. Right? And so what that means is thinking through that supply chain, thinking through the components, where do the basic components get made, where do they get assembled, and so on and so forth, so that there is a lot more self-reliance rather than relying on donor nations sending stuff over.
I imagine that involves working a lot with local communities. So what kind of work is JH Labs doing, like when they're thinking about local communities?
Our thesis is very much along the lines of what I mentioned, which is that stuff has to get made as close to the users, the market, if you will. And the way that manifests itself in our work is, let's say we work on a diagnostic device. We almost on day one try to identify companies based in lower middle income countries, like India, for example, that both have a market interest in taking this to the users, as well as the ability to make the stuff, right? So what we do is approach them very early in the process, partner with them very closely through the product development lifecycle, and then at the end, we offer them and others interested royalty-free license. All we ask in return is that these be priced fairly and accessible to low-income communities.
Okay. So we spoke about the innovations that came out of COVID-19 and how people were forced to innovate. What are some of the innovations that you were really excited about?
So, so going back to the early days of COVID, GH Labs was just starting to form, and a number of our scientists threw themselves at the problem. And back in the very, very early months, they screened a bunch of antibodies and came up with an analysis which then manifested itself in a number of FDA-approved antigen tests. Building on that, we've got a fairly exciting portfolio of things. At the most sort of complex and upstream end is, imagine if you could combine your rapid test with a nucleic acid test. Right? So something of that sort. So it's essentially a lateral flow assay, an instrument-free nucleic acid test. Obviously, something like that is very complicated, lots of potential failures. We're also quite excited about, for TB, for example, moving away from sputum towards an oral swab. That can dramatically simplify the process of sample collection and therefore more accurate diagnosis of TB. We have a number of things that are much closer to becoming a market reality. The things that we're most excited about on that end of the scale is a test for cervical cancer. Essentially what it is with a cell phone, you can take an image of the cervix and identify precancerous lesions. We use AI machine vision algorithms to come up with a pretty good analysis. Building on that work, we're also hoping to do stuff on ultrasound for lung anomalies, for obstetrics. we have a we're very excited about our machine vision, machine learning teams, and we're hopeful that pretty soon we can get some of the stuff out there.
So you spoke about innovations that cover like a wide range of diseases, and I know that JH Labs does a lot of that, and you're quite passionate about. Do you think COVID will have like that kind of influence that we'll now see innovations and things coming to the market quicker because of what we experienced during these last years of the pandemic?
I think so. I certainly hope so. You know, one of the silver linings, if you can call it that, with COVID was how everybody threw themselves at the problem, right? We had people working 24 hours, you know, happy to share what they knew, going well above and beyond what their job called for. Hopefully, that spirit of collaboration persists, and so that's one thing I hope that happens. The other thing I hope that comes out of it is what I mentioned earlier, which is removing some of the barriers to a concentrated supply chain so that things can be more freely available where they're needed.
Okay, so what do we need to do in order to remove these barriers?
You know, a couple of things, I think. One is, as I keep coming back to the question of supply chain because that's the buzz phrase these days, right? Really thinking about where things have to be done versus where things can be done.
Yeah.
Right? And what that means is there can be regional centers of innovation and manufacturing even at the East African level, at the West African level, and so on and so forth. And I'm hoping that that is kind of the biggest step change that occurs, is a much more investment in that kind of production and innovation capability. Whether it's through universities, whether it's through startups, whether it's through companies that decide that it's worth making some sort of investment there.
Okay, and do you foresee these investments happening? And is this something that's already happening? Do you think people recognize the need for these investments?
It is happening. I don't know if it's happening as fast as it should. One thesis I personally have, which is yet to be fully proven, is I'm from India, right? And India is an interesting combination of pretty much all the problems we see across the developing world, plus lots of companies, lots of engineering. And a lot of these companies are quite hungry to serve the low-income market, not just in India, but other LMICs as well. Right? So one thesis we'll explore heavily is whether by sharing our IP with these companies in India, whether we can encourage them not just to serve the Indian lower income market, but also then expand through joint ventures or something else with companies in Kenya and Nigeria and Ghana, Rwanda, and so on, where there is enough of a platform for some sort of a sustainable market-based entry. Now, this won't immediately serve the needs of the poorest of the poor, but at the very least, if these things get mainstreamed, there is hopefully an organic and a sustainable path to reaching the poorest of the poor.
Yeah, and we've actually kind of spoken about this, but I know that one of the things that you're quite passionate about is local empowerment. What role can local empowerment play in making sure that these innovations actually reach the poorest of the poor, like you said?
You know, the word empowerment is interesting, right? Because it does suggest that one side of that equation has power and is willing to share with the other. I like to think of it more through the lens of equity and sustainability. And going back to the conversation we've been having last few minutes, if something is manufactured locally, you know, it ends up being more cost effective, it ends up being more sustainable and more equitable. And that's why I hope that one of the things that comes out of, you know, whatever version of Build Back Better there is for addressing these global supply chain problems, invests heavily in that kind of local stuff.
Okay, so when we started the conversation, I did mention that you spent a year at JH Labs so far. What can we expect from JH Labs in the next year? Or maybe should I make that next 5, 10 years?
Well, one of the words we all wake up with every day is urgency, right? Which is we just have to get stuff out there. The problems are happening as we speak, and we have to act every day like lives depend on it, right? And so with that spirit, we're actually hoping to get a few things out there in the market. Obviously, some of these things will take time for regulatory approval and so on and so forth. But what you should start seeing is a pipeline of things that are becoming real with the kinds of partnerships I talked about, with the kind of local relevance I talked about. Over time, I suspect that we'll have a portfolio of some exciting wins and some failures. And what I hope we have the courage to do is embrace those failures, think of them as learning experiences, and try not to make the same mistake twice.
That's super interesting, and we are looking forward to seeing more from JH Labs. We're looking forward to covering the work that you'll be doing. Thank you so much, Shashi, for joining me. We've come to the end of our conversation. Are there any kind of takeaways that you'd want to share with our audience?
I am, first of all, it's so wonderful to see so many old friends in person. What a joy. We've all missed this. I'm also very bullish. I'm hopeful that the world has learned some important lessons. And so all the things that would have been pipe dreams 5 years back, hopefully those things start becoming reality, like these policy decisions I talked about. So I'm very bullish and looking forward to talking to you again in a bit and sharing updates.
Definitely. We're looking forward to networking with you. We hope you stick around for a little bit longer. And we're definitely looking forward to seeing your work and seeing what JH Labs comes up with in the next couple of years. Thank you, Shashi.
Yeah.